This year's clashes at Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan were one of the most violent. Israeli occupation forces attacked Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque, wounding more than 150 Palestinians, while it was filled with Ramadan worshippers. Isn't Al-Aqsa a place of worship for Muslims? Why then do they become a victim of Israeli violence? Meanwhile, condemnations have poured in from Iran to Saudi Arabia, with the EU and the US to have only expressed grave concern.
Tensions are high in the occupied territories amid a recent increase in crackdown on Palestinians. Regime forces attacked worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque on Friday. Scores of Palestinians were wounded in the clashes. Around 400 people were also arrested. Muslim nations as well as resistance groups have condemned Tel Aviv. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation called on the international community to force Israel to end its aggression. Iran said Friday's events in Muslims' third holiest site show that the Palestinian resistance is alive and thriving, and Israel is in a state of desperation. Analysts believe that Tel Aviv is intentionally increasing tensions to take control of Al-Aqsa Mosque.
We think that the Israelis are escalating the whole situation in the West Bank in order, at least in Jerusalem, in order to control the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that was the aim for the settlers groups who announced many times that they wanted, to get into Al-Aqsa Mosque and practice some of their own religion kind of practices. If they did such an act, definitely that would lead to a war.
The clashes came after 3 weeks of deadly tensions in the occupied territories. Tel Aviv has deployed more forces to the West Bank and conducted raids and house searches there almost every day. This has resulted in the deaths and injuries of dozens of Palestinians. Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has given Israeli forces a free hand in their operations. Many believe that the latest escalation could turn into an uprising or a new intifada in Palestine.
Palestinian experts are warning that they could return back, let's say, to more clashes, more escalation. These killings by the Israeli forces and this escalation could anytime turn into an uprising or an intifada. No one can tell, especially that the Israelis are saying they will not end their operation. It will continue.
Palestinians have also increased their operations in response to the crackdown. Since March 22nd, they have conducted several stabbing and shooting operations, including one in Tel Aviv, leaving 14 Israelis dead. The increase in anti-Israel operations in the occupied territories show that Palestinians have reached a conclusion that they should decide their own fate, especially after several Arab countries normalized ties with Israel. Palestinians believe that resistance against occupation is the only way they have to achieve their goals.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Human rights advocate and Palestinian activist Amal Wahdan joins us from Ramallah. We also have writer, journalist, and political analyst Hafsa Kara-Mustapha joining us from London. I'd like to welcome to you both. Let me first start with you, if I may, Amal Wahdan, and let's talk about what has occurred in terms of the violence part. And the reason why I'd like to start off with this is because we need to enlighten viewers and people watching as to how the Israeli forces used extreme, means here. Looking at the entire mosque that were raided by the Israeli occupation forces, firing live bullets, tear gas, and stun grenades, preventing access to paramedics, and attacking the mosque guards, health workers, and media personnel, resulting in 150 Palestinians to have been wounded. What do you think about the tactics and the level of violence that was used by the Israeli forces?
Yeah, these tactics that they have used has surprised the prayers who were in Al-Aqsa Mosque since the raid came just after dawn. So people were not expecting a raid that early, but this is actually part of their aggression measures, increasing and escalating their measures against Palestinians. Not only this, the excessive use of arms, excessive use of tear gas and sound gas. Prayers did not expect this, so they took them in a sudden action. It caused a lot of chaos, a lot of damage to the mosque. Inside the mosque, can you imagine, anybody who's listening to us now, if a police force stormed into a church or a synagogue or a mosque in somewhere else in the Western world, this will become a real scandal, They will call the ICC to investigate and take actions against the country, against the police forces. But in Palestine, the Israeli the Israeli army, the Israeli special forces can do anything in any place. No boundaries for them to act like barbaric and like Nazis, actually. This is a fascist country. It was categorized as an apartheid state. And the last time, few days ago, Bennett has given the settlers and individuals the right to own guns and use these guns. We know that settlers in organized groups, they have their guns. They are like paratroopers to the Israeli army. But now they are giving a free hand to everybody to own arms. This is a call for war. And what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque, actually, as your report showed, that they arrested people, hundreds of people. The number that we know is 400 people. But the injured were, the first count of injured were 250. Part of them were treated in Al-Aqsa Mosque, paramedics tent, and some of them were transferred to Al-Maqasid hospital. 10 people yesterday were in
critical condition?
Yes, in very critical condition, and others were hit in the eyes, for example.
Sure, and that's what I want to talk about even more. I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, but videos showing worshippers lying on the ground, their hands tied behind their backs, children to be among the ones who are arrested, worshippers beaten by Israeli police while evacuating. The aggression here is so severe that it's skimmed over and when it's covered by the media. Meanwhile, Israel has attempted to spin the police raid, as they call it in Alaska, as an effort to protect the freedom of worship. So we can see who they're trying to serve and how they're trying to spin this story. Do you agree that they're doing that?
Well, of course not, but I think we have to put this into the current context, which is that the international media and international interest and focus is currently now on Ukraine. And what the Israelis do, and they routinely do this, is that when there's a major world event that is distracting world opinion, they will make the most of it by going on a killing spree of Palestinians. And that's exactly what they've done. They're literally making the most of this current war in Eastern Europe, which is attracting a lot of attention, and using it as an opportunity to carry out ethnic cleansing operations and operations inside places of worship that actually we wouldn't have seen Nazis do. I mean, for the past 70 years, we've heard of the horrors of the Holocaust and Nazi operations against Jews, but actually this puts Nazis to shame. This is far beyond what we've seen for 5 years happening in Germany. This has been going on for 70 years. This is an attack. These are war crimes. These are immoral crimes that should be condemned vehemently by the international community, and they're not, because Israel currently enjoys total impunity and is making the most of the situation which is distracting. Public opinion is distracted by the war in Ukraine, and they're making the most of it, knowing that essentially only Middle Eastern media will actually take interest in what's happening, whilst obviously Western media is focused elsewhere.
Amal Wahdan, perhaps you can tell us why we are having this problem carry on for all these decades, which is what's been called the flashpoint of Al-Aqsa Mosque, sacred to Muslims. We know how Jews feel about that. Why has this been a flashpoint? What can be done to remove that status?
Actually, this apartheid state was created by the superpower, by the British first, and then sponsored and nourished by the USA and the NATO countries. So this apartheid country is above any law, above international law, above human rights law. In the UN Security Council, General Assembly, they can escape any impunity, any action to stop them. We cannot even take them to ICC. The most that they can, the most that we can do is bring an investigation to their crimes. So this is one part of why this state is carrying what it's doing right now. And storming in and raiding Al-Aqsa Mosque the way they did is an escalation to a situation that was going on before. You know, groups of settlers from different settlers, radical organizations have raided Al-Aqsa Mosque, not storming in, you know, walking in or making silence prayer. They took an order from the court that they can do silent prayer in Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is inciting Muslims, and this is violating the Muslim rights of worshipping in their sacred shrines in Al-Aqsa Mosque. So barging into Al-Aqsa yesterday and raiding Al-Aqsa while you know, worshippers were ready to go for the dawn prayer is something that cannot be tolerated. And even if there wasn't any war somewhere else, like Ukraine, the international community would not even take a real measure. They will condemn. They will bring, you know, they will send some convoy delegations and delegations here, but they will not take action against this apartheid regime. Nothing is gonna stop them. They are going to repeat what they did in Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. So what happened is a big, you know, it's a flashing alarm towards the whole world. But for us Palestinians, we're continuing what we are doing right now. We're resisting. We're resisting these racist and discriminated system here. We're going to continue resisting.
Sure. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, one of the most interesting things, maybe not too much of a surprise, but yet enough of a surprise, are the demographics of some of the Palestinians that have actually protested recently. And I'm talking about in specifically what happened in Tel Aviv, and also then other Palestinians who are not affiliated with the resistance groups like Hamas or the ones out of the Gaza Strip, or even to the PA, or any groups, or any ideology. And they're coming out and they're protesting. What does that show when you're seeing Palestinians that have no affiliation of any kind coming out and actually carrying out what's been called resistance operations, which, well, the one in Tel Aviv is the one that was the most severe in terms of the results that came out of that?
Well, first of all, it does show that the Palestinian people are united in condemning the Israeli actions. But of course, it also shows that this is a problem that impacts all of Palestinian society, and it doesn't have to be exclusive to one political party. Of course, in the eyes of the Israelis and how they want to spin it, they would like to present that these actions made by Palestinians are exclusively reserved to groups that are affiliated to political parties. But actually, the upset is generalized and is across the board across Palestinian society, from all ages and from all social groups, and exactly from whether they are politicized or not. So I think this is a reflection of the upset that you have amongst Palestinians of all scopes. And I think it's mirrors the scale of the atrocity that's being committed. Obviously, this is not targeting militias or certain armed groups. This is targeting civilians who are going about their daily lives and inside places of worship, which makes it not only immoral, but actually and legally a war crime.
You talked about Amal Wahdan, about the settlers. Tell us, first of all, it's very alarming that you said that they're now allowed to bear arms. I don't have information on that, but that makes the situation rather very dangerous. Because if you can explain to us why it is that they are allowed to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque sporadically at intervals, not really well thought out or well planned from what it seems, and they are given escort by the Israeli security forces. Can you please explain to us what that story is all about?
First of all, the Islamic organization in Al-Aqsa Mosque has denounced the continuous storming into Al-Aqsa Mosque. Settlers going almost each day, day in, day out. So the settlers took this to the court, and the court allowed them to do silence praying in Al-Aqsa, which means this is the first step for them, having silence prayer, then having real prayer inside Al-Aqsa, then sacrificing, performing sacrifices in Al-Aqsa Mosque as they wanted to do yesterday. Later on, splitting, time and space, just like in Al-Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. So what they are doing is a gradual, step by step to occupy Al-Aqsa, and then do what's in their, what's in their mind, ruining Al-Aqsa. What happened yesterday has happened in 1969 when they burned Al-Aqsa. And it was really horrifying for all Muslims. Unfortunately, the Arab world has not reacted in the same, in the same level of this action. And they only condemned these massive storming in and raiding into Al-Aqsa. So what is needed to be done here is real action. And the people of Palestine had to decide that they are going to take the power into their own hands, and they're going to defend themselves. What we have to remind the whole world that we are in a defensive position, even when people like, young people like Diya and like Raad infiltrate into Tel Aviv and do these operations. This is a normal reaction of self-defense. When there is a colonization power in a place, there are colonized people who are going to resist. It's the course of history everywhere.
So let's go along those lines here. And Hafsa, Kara-Mustapha, if we have Palestinians brave enough to go out there and to risk their lives, they need to somehow be backed. Now, we know Hamas has encouraged, for example, some of these Palestinians, but even apart from Hamas, some Arab countries need to do that. Now, the reactions that came on this Al-Aqsa raid, Iran, Iraq, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, they all say that Tel Aviv must be held to account. But yet you have the European Union or the U.S. Who have said, well, this is of grave concern, and they call for an end to the immediate, an immediate end to the violence. The Arab support from the Arab countries, the leaders, it's not there the way it should be, is it?
No, not only is it not there as it should be, but actually the recent normalizations have even boosted Israeli actions because, of course, they're seeing that there is absolutely no consequence to what they're doing. Obviously, we know that they've got full backing of Western countries, so let's just put that aside for a second. But at the very least, there was a level of hostility from the Arab world, officially at least, over the years. Now, recently, with all these normalizations that have come from absolutely nowhere and for no reason, and that bring nothing to these Arab countries, and particularly the wealthy Gulf states, for instance, which don't need money, this has actually boosted Israeli actions. And the very least we should see now, and perhaps there should be more pressure. Let's ignore Israel because it won't abide by any form of pressure. But I would hope to see pressure on these Arab/Muslim countries actually sever relations with Israel as a result of these actions, because of course this violation of a mosque during Ramadan is absolutely unacceptable. It's unacceptable morally regardless of where you are and who you are, but of course for Muslim countries it's doubly unacceptable. Sure. And I think that we should put pressure on Arab countries to actually take a stand and say, well, no, normalization is no longer acceptable given what you've done. It should never have been acceptable, of course, but in these current situations, absolutely no, and there should be a severing of relations with Israel at this stage.
Amal Wahdan, a normal Palestinian who has no affiliation with anybody, goes out on the streets, risks his or her life, and then looks up to whatever respective countries, Arab countries, that are normalizing ties with Israel, such as what we saw in the Negev desert recently. I mean, when Palestinians see that, do they lose hope, and that is why their anger is spilling out onto the streets?
Actually, we have seen this before. We know that the Arabs are not, supporting our struggle against this occupation, except for those who are in line with our resistance to the occupation, like Algeria, for example, resistance in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq to a certain degree during this time that they're going through. The Gulf states have been in alliance with the USA for decades now. And they used to have relations with the Israelis, but it was under the table. Now they have advanced their ties with Israel. So this will cause more more resilient and more willingness from young people to do what they are doing, because they've been living under miserable conditions for decades.
Sorry to cut you off. We're just fresh out of time. Thank you very much for your insight, Amal Wahdan, human rights advocate and Palestinian activist. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, thank you, writer, journalist, and political analyst from London. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikava Taghbay and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.